Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I am Deepali Kanwar and I am a PhD scholar at Amity School of Economics, Amity University, Noida, India. My paper's title is India's Trade Deficit with ASEAN, an Alternative Perspective. The structure of this presentation is a brief introduction of the topic, the research goals under study, the empirical analysis undertaken to achieve the objective of the research goals, and a conclusion that is drawn from the analysis. The India-ASEAN FTA was signed in the year 2010 and it became fully implemented in the year 2019. Concessions have been offered under three broad categories of tariff elimination, tariff reduction, and the exclusion list. The tariff elimination is accounted for under the tracks of Normal Track 1 and Normal Track 2, where the tariffs were eliminated within 6 years of the ASEAN FTA coming into force. The tariff reduction is implemented under the categories of special products and sensitive track, wherein the tariffs are not completely eliminated. However, they are reduced from the current levels of MFN to a predetermined level as negotiated under the agreement. The third kind of concession or no concession that is offered is the exclusion list, wherein the MFN as is applicable on the day of import would be applied. Within the India-ASEAN FTA, India offered market access for around 88.35% of its tariff lines, which is inclusive of both the tariff elimination and the tariff reduction categories. However, the ASEAN member countries have all individually offered India their own market access offers, which have a variety of range going as high as 100% for Singapore, whereas going as low as somewhere around 70 to 75% for some of the ASEAN members. In the post-FTA period, that is in the year 2019-20, the value of imports from the ASEAN was somewhere around USD 54.2 billion. The maximum imports that were undertaken in this post-FTA period, which is around 32.4 billion USD, was undertaken for products which were included under the Normal Track 1 list. In comparison to the pre-FTA period, India's trade balance as a proportion of India's total trade vis-a-vis the ASEAN witnessed an increase from 17.5 to 27.5. However, it is essential to understand that as the size of the economy increases, so does its capacity to bear the deficits. In the pre-FTA period, that is 2009-10, the top 10 sectors accounted for somewhere around 82% of India's total imports from ASEAN. Whereas in the post-FTA period, the share of the top 10 sectors declined to 76%. It is also important to understand that the top 90% products imported at the HS 8-digit level increased from 375 to 540, indicating that there was a diversification of India's import basket vis-a-vis the ASEAN. The research goal of this paper is to analyze the structure of trade of India vis-a-vis ASEAN over the years, analyze the trade of goods liberalized under the agreement, and how the MFN and tariffs under the FTA influence trade. To undertake this empirical analysis, a study of India's trade with ASEAN has been undertaken. Around 74% of Indian tariff lines at the HS 8-digit level have a zero duty vis-a-vis the ASEAN countries. Around 11.6% have been kept under the exclusion list, and around 14.2% of Indian tariff lines have reduced duties. India's trade deficit vis-a-vis ASEAN in the year 2018 was somewhere around USD 21 billion. India's total trade with the ASEAN countries over this 10 years of implementation has increased by nearly 98%, with the increase in India's imports being at 114.6%, which is significantly higher than the increase in India's exports, which is at 73.9%. We see that India faced a trade deficit with the ASEAN, and ASEAN is not a major importer of the product categories where India holds an export advantage. It is important to understand that India has to tackle stiff competition from Chinese exports to ASEAN, proliferation of the non-tariff measures, lack of transparency in customs operations, inequitable tariff reduction measures, and disparity in tariff classification norm for non-originating material. However, India's growing integration with ASEAN in the global value chain, along with its trade and services and investments, have a lot of scope for exploration. We see that India's key products of essential use imported from the ASEAN are palm oil, coal, natural rubber, and beans. And if the import of these four products is removed from the total imports of India from the ASEAN, we see that India's deficit reduces significantly from 21 billion USD to only 6 billion USD. Furthermore, when we study the structure of India's imports from the ASEAN countries, we see that for the average period between 2016 to 2018, 62.46% of India's imports from the ASEAN were accounted for by raw materials and intermediates, whereas only 15% of total imports were accounted for by the consumer goods. However, if we see our export basket, we see that for the same time period, around 37% of total India's exports were under the consumer goods, whereas raw materials and capital goods accounted for nearly 18 and 16% respectively. The SOP classification indicates that the percentage increase in India's exports to ASEAN countries has been highest for the products under the category of consumer goods, and India's imports have been highest for the products under the category of the capital goods. Further, to understand the FTA utilization, it is required that we analyze the FTA tariff structure and the MFN tariff structure. When we go for this analysis between the study of MFN and the FTA tariff structure, we see that in 2018, of the total imports of India from ASEAN, 14.23% imports had lower MFN than the FTA tariffs, primarily raw materials or intermediates, with a few also being consumer goods. However, we see that for some products like crude palm oil and coal, the FTA tariff was actually higher than the effective MFN. For example, crude palm oil had an FTA tariff of 37.5%, but the effective MFN, considering the end-use exemption, was only 7.5%, whereas coal has an FTA tariff of 5%, but the effective MFN was 0%. On a complete analysis of the tariff structure, we see that there were 20 products where FTA tariffs is higher than the effective MFN. Therefore, there is a need to analyze India's trade under the FTA with ASEAN in cognizance with India's MFN structure and the structure of India's imports and exports in terms of the SOP and the technology intensity. When we try and understand the interplay between the MFN and the FTA tariffs, we see that for nearly 84% of tariff lines, the FTA tariff was less than the MFN tariff, which is broadly distributed for 7% of the agricultural products and 77% under the industrial products. However, we see that there is a case of an inverted duty structure, which can be seen in the case of the aluminum, wherein the duty on the intermediates is more than the duty on the consumer goods under the FTA. For example, the aluminum ingot, which is an intermediary good, has been kept under the exclusion list of the IFTA and faces a 7.5% duty. However, the articles of aluminum, which are made from aluminum ingots, has a zero duty. Therefore, showing that there is an inverted duty structure that has been created because of the FTA. So this is actually impacting the domestic production, as it's cheaper to buy the finished goods than import the raw materials or intermediate goods and manufacture in India itself. However, there are also cases where the MFN is preferred to the FTA tariffs because the MFN is lower. India imported USD 675 million worth of pepper and around 57 billion worth of palm oil since the IFTA was implemented. Both have been kept under the special products category in the IFTA. However, if we see, pepper has an FTA tariff of 50%, but the effective duty, which is actually paid, is only 30%. Crude palm oil has an FTA tariff of 37.5%, but the effective MFN is only 7.5%. indicating that they are products which have huge value in terms of the imports. However, there is a possibility that the FTA is not the reason why the imports of these products has actually increased, because the MFN route could be preferred over the FTA route as the tariffs are significantly lower. The conclusions that can be drawn from this analysis is that since the implementation of the FTA, India's imports have seen a higher percentage of increase than India's exports vis-a-vis the ASEAN countries. The key products imported by India are either raw materials or intermediates in nature, indicating that India also has a very ideal trade basket vis-a-vis the ASEAN countries, whereas our imports are primarily of raw materials and intermediates. However, our export basket is primarily constituted of the consumer goods. India's exports might not have improved bilaterally vis-a-vis the ASEAN. However, the value addition which is brought into the imports from ASEAN has been able to facilitate the increase of India's overall exports to the world. We also see that the key imports from the ASEAN, which is crude palm oil and refined palm oil, actually face lower MFN tariffs as compared to the FTA tariffs, and indicating that FTA is the reason behind the increase in imports of palm oil from the ASEAN country might not actually be true. Furthermore, because of the lack of disaggregated data in terms of the trade occurring under the MFN route and under the FTA route, we are unable to present forth the exact proportion or the share of imports which is happening under the FTA. However, if in future there is the availability of such kind of utilization data, this analysis can even furthermore be augmented and can be analyzed. I thank you all for your giving me this opportunity to present my analysis. Thank you.